Okay. Is it on now? Yeah. Good. Wonderful. My name is Kerstin Barnd, and as director of the Museum Studies program and also associate professor in German and Museum Studies, I'm very pleased to welcome you here in person at Stern's Auditorium after 23 months of online museum studies programming. This is actually my first big museum studies event since I became director. And I'm especially delighted to welcome Lisa Yan Lee to this auditorium, to these halls, to our campus today. Today's lecture begins Lisa's multi-day program as the Museum Studies 2022 visiting scholar. We are very grateful for the partnership of numerous units on campus that have made this visit possible. They include the Institute for the Humanities and the Department of American Culture. And I would also like to thank Museum Studies Administrative Assistant Amy Smoller and my colleague, Associate Director Deirdre Hannebury, for organizing this event. Before I properly introduce Lisa Yan Lee to you, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. We acknowledge that our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained through the dispossession of indigenous people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This transfer of land was offered as a gift through the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids so that their children could be educated. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded and to flourish. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to the land and their profound contributions to this institution. As we acknowledge harm done and commit to reparative work, we see our work in museum studies as deeply interconnected with these histories. We feel very fortunate to be able to hear from Lisa today and to learn from her over the coming days. She will bring to our attention a one-of-a-kind museum project in Chicago that puts national public housing, its tenants, and housing as a human right squarely at the center. As executive director of the National Public Housing Museum, curator, scholar, and cultural activist, Lisa propelled the work of the museum towards its public opening in 2019. At the University of Illinois at Chicago, Lisa is a member of the Art History, Museum and Exhibition Studies, and Gender and Women's Studies program faculty. After receiving her PhD in German Studies at Duke University with a dissertation and book publication on the dialectics of the body in philosopher Theodor Adorno's writing, and it was there at Duke where our path first crossed. Lisa moved to UIC with a detour to New York City, as I just learned, to direct the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, and her transformative museum work began. Together with her staff, Lisa reinvigorated Jane Addams' humanist, pacifist, and feminist vision for the 21st century and inaugurated, among lots of other innovative programming, a vibrant public program called Rethinking Soup in the residence dining hall of one of the original settlement house buildings that were part of the museum. In a fabulous essay, Hungry for Peace, Lisa describes the event, and I quote, "It features a bowl of delicious, healthy soup and serves as a democratic forum of critical food justice issues. It is a collective dining experience that feeds people's minds and bellies, as well as their hunger for community." End of quote. I'm citing Lisa's essay, Hungry for Peace, not only for the beauty and the ideas and practices expressed in it, but also because it gives me pause to reflect on the many layers of our present day. As the war rages in Ukraine and thousands of Ukrainians are fleeing their homes under Russian bombardment, today is also International Women's Day, a holiday both in Russia and in Ukraine, and celebrated throughout the world. And that day upholds the vision of peace, equality, and sustainability. For Jane Addams, these discordant layers always intersected. And they inspired imaginative political action and communal learning. And I'm very heartened to hear that Lisa is working on a monograph entitled Teaching Jane Addams that draws from her work at the Hull House Museum. In her other writings, research, and museum practice, Lisa returns to the relationship of aesthetics and politics and how to bridge the divide between arts, culture, and public policy work. She writes and researches on museums and diversity, on cultural and environmental sustainability, and on museums as spaces for fostering radically democratic practices. The recipient of the 2013 Public Humanities Award at the Illinois Humanities Council, Lisa also served as the co-chair of the Arts and Culture Transition Team for Chicago's Mayor Lori Lightfoot. She's a member of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials Collaborative and serves on the boards of the Field Foundation and 3 Arts. She also teaches with the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project in Stateville Prison. In 2020, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker appointed Lisa to serve on the Illinois State Museum Board. And most recently, she was appointed to the Advisory Committee for the City of Chicago's Racial Healing and Historical Reckoning Project to assess memorials, monuments, and other public art. As you will undoubtedly realize the minute I turn things over to Lisa, her energy and commitment does not stop here. From the Rethinking Soup initiative at the Hull House Museum, she has brought into being multiple new formats to the National Public Housing Museum, including a complete rethinking of the museum store as corner store co-op that focuses on the entrepreneurial history of public housing and supports small businesses and cooperatives by public housing residents to promote economic equality and equity. Across Lisa Young Lee's manifold activities as a curator, writer, and activist, we encounter museum work that knows no bounds, but is anchored in a deep commitment to creativity, justice, and radical imagination. Please welcome Lisa Yan Lee.
Oh my gosh, that was so good. Thank you. Oh my gosh, that was such a good introduction. I barely need to speak now, for real. I wish my mom had been here. She would have been so proud. You guys, we're here in real life. Yay! I know, and I really thank you all for coming. You know, we all know that you could be anywhere in the world now with Zoom, but you chose to be here, and it really means a lot. And thank you so much to Kirsten, to Amy, to Deirdre for organizing it, and also to dear friends who showed up tonight. I'm really excited to talk to you about this work. Now, before we actually start, I want to actually give you a chance to experience the kind of programming and spirit that we have at the National Public Housing Museum. And so during the pandemic, we reinvented our programming sort of yet again. And one of our most popular projects was something called Civic Love. And it's something that has opened international film festivals. It's been used at racial justice summits across the country, for commencement at several universities, and as part of correspondence course in many prisons also. And so I wanted you to have a chance to experience it. And what is Civic Love? So, in 1997, psychologist Arthur Aaron explored whether intimacy between two perfect strangers could be accelerated by asking each other a set of 36 questions. The National Public Housing Museum adapted his questions for use in a new kind of social experiment aimed at helping us all fall in civic love with one another. You may be wondering, what is civic love? Here's what we learned. Civic love is one's love for society expressed through a commitment to the common good and to a commonwealth. It is a belief in the idea that we are all better off when we are all better off. We manifest it through all kinds of actions: volunteering, marching, speaking against systemic injustice, doing work for reparations. But the love itself is the emotional heart of the work. And in the spirit and activist of Grace Lee Boggs, 36 Questions for Civic Love is an attempt to help bring to our communities the limitless capacity to love, serve, and know one another in order to work and build together. So, if you cannot get to sort of know one another with critical generosity, how can we actually try to imagine a different world that is better for all of us? So in this sort of project that we're going to do for around 5 minutes, your task is to practice listening and sharing about yourself. You're going to listen with curiosity, resist the urge to respond to your partner's answers, and allow space to simply share and be heard. So how is this going to work? And I have absolute faith that we're going to be able to do this without too much chaos and commotion. So what I want you to do in a second is I want you to sort of stand up and find someone that you don't know, probably turning to somebody behind you, not next to you, because you probably came with the person next to you, but not to the person behind you. And I want you to introduce yourself, share your preferred pronouns, and then you're actually going to take turns asking one another a question. And I'm going to put the question sort of on the board. And in 36 Questions for Civic Love, the questions begin with, what's your favorite kitchen smell? But it goes up to, under what conditions would you call the police on a neighbor? What privilege would you be willing to give up, and under what circumstances, right? But we're actually only going to do the sort of first 5 as a little bit of experiment, okay? Do you guys feel like you know what's happening? I'm going to also actually do it with somebody, so I'll maybe do it with Julie. Is that okay? All right. So can we do this for 5 minutes? So all you're going to do is, and we'll maybe practice right now. I'm going to say to Julie, hi, Julie, my name is Lisa. She, her, hers. What's your favorite kitchen smell?
I'm Julie, and she, her, hers. And my favorite kitchen smell is my husband's applesauce.
Cool. And then you're just going to ask me the same question.
Can you keep a plant alive?
No, you have to ask me the question, what's my favorite kitchen smell?
What's your favorite kitchen smell?
I would have to say a pot of rice on the stove. And then you ask me the second one.
Can you keep a plant alive?
Absolutely. My mom has the most amazing green thumb that she transferred to me. Julie, can you keep a plant alive?
Only recently.
Great. Got it. So you're just going to do it and go through these 5 questions, okay? All right, so find a stranger and go for it. Yeah, why don't you, Julie? All right, try to finish up soon. All right. If you can, come back together. Thank you so much, everybody, for playing. How did that go? Thumbs up, thumbs medium, thumbs down? Oh, awesome. Good. If you are curious, definitely exchange deets with the person that you were talking about and maybe go to the website. You can download the toolkit, and all 36 questions are sort of there for you to explore. And this is something that we often use before we have a really hard question that we need to tackle, right? Like around sort of, finding more affordable housing in the city, or questions around police violence. And it's definitely born from a lot of my work at the Hull House, where in my research of that history, I realized that those incredible women who worked with Jane Addams and the tens of thousands of immigrants who came through that space, they never had a serious conversation about anything before they ate together, danced together, sang together, or actually got to know one another first. And the sort of amazing sort of social justice, social welfare programs that they created and sustained sort of themselves through over 30, to 35 years, was really because they were willing to actually have critical generosity with absolute strangers and get to know one another. Okay, cool. All right, so now the real talk. So I love to start with this slide because it gives you a sense and it underscores how difficult the path to create the National Public Housing Museum has been. For many, many years, there was this sort of incredulous sensibility that what? You're creating a public housing museum? Who the hell would want to go to a public housing museum? And, I'm happy to say that we've done a lot of cultural organizing work to sort of change that tide. And now, many people are calling us the sort of museum of the future, although I'm sure all of us in the museum field are sort of sick of that moniker now. Everything is the museum of the future, museum of the future. But, I feel really proud of this work, but I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. And what this talk is going to be is I'm going to sort of go back in time and tell you a little bit how we got here, and a little bit sort of how the sausage is made, sort of what the problems were, and how some of the things we grappled with and we worked out, and other things that are still completely obscure and something that I'm not sure exactly how we're going to figure out. So in the late stages of urban renewal in the 1990s, Chicago had some of the most notorious housing projects in the country. Dilapidated infrastructure from deferred and lack of maintenance, escalating violence due to gangs, but also because of police acting with impunity, and other types of long-term neglect in critical social services like public schools and public health, and widespread corruption all contributed to the problem. It got to be so terrible that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, seized control of Chicago Housing Authority in 1995 in one of the federal government's highest profile efforts to salvage a failing system of public housing. In 1999, the CHA brokered a deal with HUD to return the CHA to local control in exchange for a vow that Chicago would radically change its approach to public housing. And with a massive $1.6 billion budget funded for the most part by the federal government's HOPE 6 program, an acronym for Home Ownership Opportunities for People Everywhere, the Plan for Transformation proposed a fundamentally new approach to public housing in Chicago. One of the first actions was the bulldozing of 11 high-rise public housing developments that, when demolished, represented the largest net loss of affordable housing in the history of the United States. Say their names: Robert Taylor Homes, Cabrini Green, Stateway Gardens, Ida B. Wells Homes, Jane Addams Homes, Harold Ickes Homes, Grace Abbott Homes, Henry Horner Homes, Randolph Homes, Loomis Courts. The names of the projects conjure feelings and thoughts in the popular imagination, usually not of the vibrant communities that live there, nor the people who formed imaginative and complex networks of support and long-lasting friendships, but of stereotypes of what it meant to be poor and Black in America. And while the Plan for Transformation sought to deliberately disrupt entrenched patterns of segregation and concentrated poverty, it also launched an ambitious experiment of social engineering in the United States called mixed income housing that integrated public housing residents into the larger social, economic, and physical fabric of Chicago. It is not evident why or how the idea of people living in poverty living next to people with money became the ersatz solution to actually alleviating and addressing the root causes of poverty. But it is unambiguous that Chicago was not alone. All across the country, plans like these were initiated with federal incentives aimed to transform public housing for poor families into mixed income communities. In New York City, for right now, for example, there's like even tonight, there is a big gathering with the new mayor there because they're discussing something called the Blueprint. And the Blueprint shares many of the elements of Chicago's urban renewal plans. This is sort of Cabrini coming down, one of the most famous pictures. By creating mixed income family units and developments that included but were not dominated by public housing, and creating a voucher system for apartments under long-term rent subsidy contracts in privately owned developments, Chicago intentionally shifted much responsibility for housing to the private sector. Private developers now own and manage a substantial portion of CHA's portfolio, and private landlords also benefit from the voucher-based programs. Historian Larry Vail has emphasized that the history of public housing is as much about housing as it is about our relationship to the idea of the public, and our shifting and listless commitment to the public sphere as a place where we can all make claims and thrive. The democratic commitment to housing as a basic necessity, understood as a public good that is part of a commonwealth, versus the understanding of housing as a commodity in a vibrant market economy in the private sector and an opportunity to make bank. These notions are deeply at odds with one another. Since the launch of the plan, Chicago has also seen one of the biggest migrations of African Americans since the Great Migration, but this time out of Chicago. In this reverse Great Migration, Chicago has lost over 70,000 African Americans in the last 5 years, some independently choosing to leave for the warmth of the actual sun in the South, but also primarily due to the lack of public and affordable housing in the city. Experts from the Urban Institute predict that by 2030, Chicago's African American population will shrink to 665,000 people from a post-war high of roughly 1.3 million. Which will have far-reaching political, social, economic, and cultural impacts on all of our lives. Now, I'm going to sort of play this video because it's that classic moment where the brilliantly astute Baldwin says that urban renewal is Negro removal. And I sort of went back to it, and it's just really so, I think, important for us to watch over and over again. Let's see if I can get it.
A boy last week, who was 16 in San Francisco, told me on television, I got to talk. Maybe somebody was talking to listen. He said, I got no country, I got no flag. I was only 16 years old. And I couldn't say he do. I don't have the evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house. Because San Francisco is engaging, as all most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving Negroes out. It means Negro renewal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or some abstraction called Negro problem. These Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says, don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country. Am I exaggerating?
No, I certainly could not say that you're exaggerating.
Sorry, I should have captioned it. I apologize. While the city has replaced some of those units, activists and advocates are engaged in debates about how to hold the city accountable for the units that have not been replaced. And the reverberations and ramifications of the plan are something that Chicago will urgently need to address and of lasting importance for all cities across this country, where tens of thousands of public housing units have been demolished. In 2000, the museum was founded. And, it was one of those things that the wake of the plan for transformation was felt everywhere. And in addition to marching in the streets and protesting it, a group of public housing residents wanted to harness the power of place and memory in order to save one of the last buildings of the Jane Addams homes in order to create a museum. And if you think about it, it's quite extraordinary that sort of as one of the tools in their toolbox to try and save public housing, a group of residents said, we actually need a museum. Now, partially it's because they didn't actually understand the history of museums, right? Because if they did, they may not have actually said that's the right tool to sort of use. But what they wanted to do was harness the power of place and memory in order to challenge mainstream narratives about the failures of public housing, what it meant to be poor, and what it meant to be on public assistance. There was this deep, visceral understanding that there was a narrative, one mainstream story about public housing that undergirded the dismantling of this public good, and that the erasure of the buildings, of the objects, of the artifacts of public housing was part of the tool of white supremacy and power in order to erase them and their stories. And when there is a kind of single story, we know that there's no way to know the stories of community resilience and collective joy in public housing. There's no way to know the vibrant networks and friendships, the sort of book clubs and the bridge clubs. And in a single story, we cannot know the veterans who returned from war, who made a home there. And in a single story, we never learn of the ingenuitive poetry programs that Miss Gwendolyn Brooks funded at Cabrini Green. And in a single story, we never understand the policies of the systemic social issues that contributed to racialized poverty, crumbling buildings, and the lack of public safety. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has warned us that there is a danger when we reduce a complex human being or a situation to a single narrative. And Adichie says, when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place or person, we regain a kind of paradise. Residents understood that changing the mainstream narrative about public housing history is vital cultural work that must be done and critically important for the present and future of housing as a human right. So amidst all the demolition, Ms. DeVera Beverly and other people came together, and they actually said, we want to save this building, create a museum, and this should be an institution where there would never again be a single story about public housing. The building that they identified was the one right behind all of this sort of demo, this one. And it was part of a 1938 demonstration project constructed by the Public Works Administration with the intention of showcasing visionary public housing ideas and embracing the government's responsibility to its people during Depression. The site at one point consisted of 32 buildings with more than 987 apartment units and 52 row houses. John Hollibird, one of Chicago's leading architects, the architect of the Board of Trade and many other magnificent Art Deco buildings, headed the team that envisioned the complex as a welcoming village of linked three-story brick buildings. There was also a beautiful central courtyard featuring a whimsical animal court playground of concrete sculptures of dogs, peacocks, pumas, and other animals made by maverick Chicago artist Edgar Miller. And as part of sort of the process of saving the building, the museum helped to also save the sort of animals and bring them back in a restoration project. And so they are put back into the courtyard. The Jane Addams Homes had provided a convivial home for tens of thousands of multiracial working-class residents who were chronically under or unemployed. But the facility had endured decades of escalating problems, including neglect and disrepair, and the last remaining residence from Jane Addams Homes was moved in 2002. I was asked by the residents to be the first board member of this institution while I was the director of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum. And we sort of, in the first it took a while, but finally in 2018, we actually got the building from HUD and the land for 99 years for $1. And one of the sort of first things that I did when I became the director in 2018 was, we joined as a member of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, a network that the Hull House Museum was also part of. And this is that network of historic sites that includes District 6 and the Gulag Museum and the Tenement Museum in New York City. And our sort of methodology is so simple, yet is something that not all historic sites do, which is the methodology is in order to preserve history, you must make it relevant to the most critical social justice issues of today. And you have to insist that we cannot solve the biggest problems facing us today without becoming astute students of history. In order to solve today's problems, we need to go upstream. And upstream for us is going back in time and asking questions like, how did it get this way? How might it be otherwise? History museums often forget that history only exists if there is a tomorrow. History museums, in this way, have less to do with the past than with making sure that we have a future worth living. And after working with the museum for almost a decade, I transitioned, became the director in 2018. We got the sort of building's lease, and we started to ask critical questions about what should be in this building. And I have to say, for many, many years, the idea was that we just have to celebrate all the freaking famous people who came from public housing. And so there was a lot of exhibits, did you know that Sonia Sotomayor grew up in public housing? Did you know that Jimmy Carter? Did you know that Jay-Z grew up in public housing? And it was like a kind of celebration of everything good. And then slowly, residents realized that that sort of narrative was also just a single narrative that was replacing the other mainstream narrative. And that, and one of our board members says it so beautifully, that we need to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the other board member says we have to tell the story of our in-laws and our outlaws. And so a lot of the sort of history for me has been trying to grapple with how do you tell these really difficult stories? What are the sort of aesthetics and the politics of telling really traumatic stories over and over again? And I'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the sort of first critical questions that I had to deal with was about representation. How might we preserve this building without fostering a kind of fetishistic, voyeuristic attitude? So one of the first scholars I talked to help imagine the future of this space included the really brilliant art historian Dora Appel. And Appel's scholarship troubles the sort of romantic and cultural work that ruin imagery performs and the political uses to which it is put. And she writes in her important work about Detroit, the romantic narrative and beauty of decay in the ruined image produces pleasure by containing and controlling the anxiety of decline through the safety and distance of representation. And people would sort of come into this building and be like, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. You have to just preserve it exactly like this, And partially, some of these spaces, when I saw this amazing wall that said, abandon hope, ye all who enter here, I really was almost convinced that, we should just present the building like this. But of course, when you present a building like this, the only story it really tells is the story of neglect and how HUD didn't let us get the building for 20 years, and so we let it go into disrepair. It doesn't actually tell the stories of the people who are living there, right? And I love this particular quote from Dora, which is, "This is the cultural function of ruin imagery. The mental mastery of the terrifying is its nature and purpose. Even as it makes evident the disastrous effects of capitalism, the more aesthetically refined and pleasing the ruin, the more effective the distancing." So for us, this became a kind of really decade-long grappling with what is the appropriate aesthetics for a museum like this. And so, of course, the way that we dealt with it is to sort of evade the visual and instead go to the oral and sound. And, Kirsten sort of mentioned my background is in sort of Frankfurt School studies. And so there was also this moment where Frankfurt School scholars were so enthralled and raptured by the potential of radio and the voice, And so I was like, okay, maybe we should actually do something a little bit different instead of just digging into the visual. And so what we did was, we sort of very quickly, we preserved a lot of the things that were going into decay, like gathered every single paint sample that we could in the space so that we knew that we could represent it or use it in wayfinding. But instead of sort of dealing with the visual, what we decided to do was sort of go to oral history. In the tradition of people like Ida B. Wells Barnett, Studs Terkel, and Timuel Black, and sort of utilize methodologies of oral history for recording and preserving the histories of so-called ordinary people whose stories had been excluded from mainstream historical narratives in order to build an archive of public housing stories and also to just do the work of listening. And in the early years, graduate students with oral history training would interview public housing residents. But we knew that archives, like museums, are not neutral, and that archives have reinscribed power and privilege in practices. And when residents asked us if they could not only be the narrators, but also become trained as oral historians, we hosted our first oral history summer school. And, we did sort of an extraordinarily diverse syllabus with a really diverse group of 15 public housing residents. And we did oral history methodology, the ethics of media, and then also media skills. And then we hired 6 of them to work as our oral historians to become part of our oral history core. And in addition to helping to build the archive, public housing residents now also contribute to research for ongoing exhibition projects and help curate stories for our podcasts that are on the radio in Chicago and Philadelphia. And we're also training residents throughout the nation now in Omaha and in Houston and Oakland and other places. The newest iteration of the oral history summer school is that we will just sort of train people informally in oral history, give people recorders, and we don't necessarily have to hire them. We just think this is a really important skill for organizing, for whatever, for gathering the stories of your elders, and it's been a really productive project for us, and also a whole new world of sort of questions also have emerged. And so, for example, in a couple of weeks, we'll release our newest project, which I feel so excited about, and this is a little bit of a preview, but we had sort of recorded a story of somebody who talked a lot about how she would drink a lot and use drugs and then go into the animal court, the animal pictures that I showed you, and sort of rest her head there, seek comfort, and to sort of get herself together for the next day. And when she recorded that story, then it sort of came into our archive, and then we actually had to do the finding aid. So there was a graduate student who was working with us and started to sort of put the finding aid together and would sort of put alcoholism, drug use, and things like that. And when she came back one day, Miss Ida said, wait, I'm not alcoholic, and yeah, I use drugs, but why is this story being put under the topic drug use? Why isn't it under the headline and topic comfort, resilience, and things like that? And so we realized that at all points of the archive and the construction of the archive, that narrators should be empowered to also do the finding aid and sort of lead the listener into how people would access their stories. And so we have a new archive director now, and so we're going to be releasing our finding aid that is made together with public housing residents in a couple of weeks, and it's really exciting. So I'm just going to let you listen to one of the stories that we've gathered?
Actually, there were two primary forms of entrepreneurship in my part of Cabrini Green. There was the candy truck or candy store and someone's beauty salon in their kitchen. Of course, the candy store was the most fun, and for us, it was a truck, an old hollowed out truck. There were multiple candy trucks in the neighborhood. None were mobile, let me be clear. And they built homemade shelves along the sides of the truck, and they put little boxes of candy on the sides of the truck. And so you would step up into the candy truck. Kids, would take their nickel and go down and buy 5 pieces of candy from the candy truck. I mean, the truck was maybe 4 feet by 5 feet. And so you were huddled down a little bit, and you just pointed, I want one of those and one of those and one of those. Oh man, they had bubble gum, and remember the little dots that would come on long sheets of paper, and the candy necklaces that you could wear around your neck and eat off a piece and, get mosquito bites because of the sugar and all that. I don't remember many of us being able to afford candy bars, but they would have candy bars. Candy businesses were strong forms of entrepreneurship. And then, of course, the kitchen beauty salon. In our neighborhood, it was Miss Gertrude who did all the hair. So for Easter, for Christmas, you had to make appointments pretty far in advance. And you would sit at her kitchen table, and you would watch this hot comb come from the fire closer and closer to your head. And before you knew it, you were walking out with a head full of curls and beautiful and ready for Easter Sunday.
Listening to all these stories, really listening, was one of the most generative acts for the museum. For example, early on, we heard stories like that, and also stories about all of these amazing cooperatives that existed in public housing, ones that we had never heard about, like the Altgeld Cooperative, which was one of the largest cooperatives of the entire nation, and a place that actually would sort of be lots of sort of hippies from Wisconsin would drive down to Chicago and learn from the Altgeld Garden residents like how to do cooperative and solidarity economy work. Miss Hallie Amy, who was one of the leaders of the project, also worked to build cooperative gardens. They had cooperative laundry mats, and in a kind of sort of nascent and really powerful critique of racial capitalism, they were building the solidarity economy with an alternative way of building economic power, working with one another, and their definition of entrepreneurship wasn't individualism and self-sufficiency, but it was, collaboration and being dependent on one another. And we just thought this was so beautiful. And so in one of the meetings when we were sitting around talking with public housing residents and they were looking at the plans, and I sort of said, well, of course we're going to have our store here. And they were like, store? Like, what's the store? And we went to the MCA, which is the Museum of Contemporary Art together, and they saw this like beautiful store. And then we looked at the sort of economics where so much of the earned income of a museum comes in from a really good store. And they asked if they could actually participate. And so through this whole process, we developed what Kirsten mentioned, which is the Corner Store Cooperative, which our museum store is its own independent cooperative, which is owned and run by public housing residents, in which we distribute and share all the profits with them. And one of the first projects that we did was work with public housing youth in collaboration with the artist, and they sort of they designed our logo for the t-shirt, printed them, they came together and sold them, and now there's a eHub working group, and they just launched also an online store. And they really have a lot of independence, including when I was like, nobody's going to pay $30 for a tote, but they want to do that. So in any case, and it's this moment where I think we're challenging the sort of very rigid definitions of what a nonprofit is, what a museum is, and also challenging this so-called 501c3 nonprofit industrial complex, where you sort of assume that the nonprofit is the best way of organizing work with the community, and it's one of the most exciting things. And a little bit of a preview, because we haven't even talked about this with our board yet, our museum itself is on HUD land, and so we are limited in some of the things that we want to do. Like, for example, early on, we were talking about economic justice and marijuana business, which is so huge now that it's legalized. And they were like, oh my gosh, we should run a 21st century candy store and it should just be edibles in the museum, right? Like, we would kill it. And it's such a good idea. And they started working on the business model. But because it's national, it's HUD land, you're not allowed to, it's not, marijuana is not legalized then. And so then they were thinking about maybe they would do, open up, do something else. And then we were talking the other day about sort of the virtual museum and how it has to be so much more robust in these days, especially since COVID. And they were like, wait a minute, the actual museum is you all, and then we have our co-op, but what if the virtual museum was a cooperative museum that all the museum employees could also join, and then it would be owned by the museum employees? And that got everyone so excited, and so we started working with our pro bono lawyers. And so I think, and I'm super excited, to not just be like the ED of the institution, but when we launch our online virtual museum, for that to actually be a cooperative museum site. And so like all of these things are possible, and there's that beautiful phrase, which is, sort of demand the impossible, and this is what this crew is really doing. Now, another part of this entrepreneurship hub is our cultural workforce program. The statistics come out every single year, and they're so disheartening, right? And this is a little bit older, maybe from, like, this is pre-pandemic, but that 28% of museum staff are people of color, but 99% of those people of color work as janitors or security guards, the lowest paid workers. And so we knew that we did not want to replicate this system. We also had been reading Ruthie Gilmore and other writings about abolition and thinking about how museums reinscribe surveillance and empower this sort of surveillance state in the way that they do their business. And so we decided that we weren't going to have any security guards, that everybody would become sort of a 21st century reimagined visitor service department that was, they were educators and they were trained to curate and do a whole range of things. And we started researching precedents, and we found the Chicago Tenant Patrol. At that time, Jamie Calvin, who's an amazing abolitionist and worked on the city, started to do this work because he said, oh my gosh, the Chicago Tenant Patrol is one of the most under-examined self-organized groups in the history of the United States. Public housing residents, when they realized there was no real safety in public housing projects, they organized themselves and they redefined what public safety actually was as taking care of kids, making sure people had things to eat, that the buildings were actually safe. And public housing residents sort of said, wait, isn't that the sort of stuff you're talking about that you need to happen in the museum? Like, people who are in the museum, making sure people are okay, welcoming them with critical and radical generosity. And so we decided that we would do a kind of 21st century Chicago Tenant Patrol, but after really investigating the Tenant Patrol, having an exhibit about it, and coming together and thinking how this could be a version of our kind of workforce, and looking at how they created the guidelines. And so I'm super excited about that project also, and we're about to hire our first director of education, who will be a public housing resident, who will help to do workforce training and all of these other things. And the public housing residents have been giving tours and doing sort of all sorts of theatrical theater exercises for like presentation, and it's been a really fun and wonderful project. So we're also really proud that we drafted and signed a CBA, a Community Benefits Agreement, with public housing residents, which is a binding legal document that affirms our commitment to be accountable in ways that institutions often do not imagine. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about sort of art, which is the other deep love that I have, and also something that this museum is infused with. So while there always has been a long-standing and concerted effort to recognize the deep wellspring of knowledge and expertise of public housing residents, who we consider our primary stakeholders in our community. We recognize them as so-called organic intellectuals. We also believe that just because you grew up in public housing doesn't mean you have a critique or analysis of public housing. And so throughout the years, the museum has also relied on the research and contributions of an interdisciplinary group of advisors, including Larry Vail, Rhonda Williams, Roberta Feldman, Edward Rothstein, Mary Patillo, and many, many others. And the museum has become a really powerful space to bring theory and practice together through praxis. And one of my favorite essays ever is an evocative work by Jules David Prown, who is one of the key figures in material culture, and it's called The Truth of Material Culture, History or Fiction. And I'm so attracted to his argument about this root, etymological root, and also the historical and social root connection of art and artifacts. And I've come back over and again to this really beautiful section where he suggests that while history has consistently taken small historical facts and often used them to build large untruths, art, poetry, and literature always begin with a small fiction, but they weave them into the most profound truths. And so this is not to suggest that the realm of facts is not important or ineffectual, because we are, after all, a history museum, but instead it admits that most of us do not make sense of our lives through simple, uncontested forensic truths. While an encounter with a fact in a history museum offers certainty and tethers us to a reality in a way, it does not render visible or begin to convey the liberating totality and rich complexity of affect, emotions, and sensations that constitute human experience. And so for that reason, the museum incorporates artists and art in several different ways. So one of the first things that I did was launch a national art competition and commission project for the entrance of the museum. And we worked with Dina Hagag from USA Artists at that time, and she's now at the Mellon Foundation. And Amanda Williams and Olilek and Jayafus were chosen. And they didn't even actually provide a kind of sample of a commission. They actually just talked about their process. And their process was so beautiful of sort of weaving through this history of engagement with public housing residents, of their willingness to take those colors that we had gathered and sort of listen to what the stories said about residents who would paint their building and their own homes with collective joy. And they were so inspiring. And so they actually went and they designed, Amanda, for those of you who do not know, her work is to actually take the colors of Black life, like Ultra Sheen, Pink Oil Moisturizer, Harold's Chicken, or otherwise. And she sort of looked at all our colors, and she made us a kind of colorscape for the museum itself. And then they created like this beautiful entranceway, which is, from these pieces of paint. And there are stories, audio stories about people, how they use style as an act of resistance against the monotony and of public housing projects and sort of the importance of color. And it was such a beautiful thing that we realized that we wanted to have art all throughout the museum at critical moments. And so there was a kind of whiteboard of, what are the things that we really want to convey, and what are the artifacts that we have that we can do it, but who are the artists that we can also engage and work with. The other thing that we realized was that in those Jewel Prown's writings, there's so much about how art and storytelling insist urgently on a kind of accountability that facts actually don't. And if you think about the root of storytelling, which is to give an account, like it shares that root with moral accountability. And it also shares that root with fiscal, like the keeping of fiscal accounts, right? Of sort of like making sure that there's like really full accountability, or in the case of many of things that we're talking about, like reparations, and making sure that there's actual money going into the things that in neighborhoods where money should be going into. And so we started exploring what it would mean to really commit to linking arts, culture, and public policy, and all these forms of giving accounts, moral accountability and the keeping of accounts. And so one of the first projects that we did was bring William Estrada together with housing activists who were trying to pass the Just Housing Initiative in Chicago, which would make it illegal to discriminate against people who had a record when they were applying for housing. And they said that they didn't actually have any kind of visual imagery that they could share, that they were basically felt like a little bit like Cassandra, like speaking the truth, but nobody would listen. And that's like the worst fate, right? Like to be a sort of Cassandra effect. And so William designed like all these different posters for them, and we made postcards, and we had an exhibit about the project, and the posters were sort of distributed as an art project, but they also were sort of carried in protests outside City Hall. And we're really proud that it was our sort of first foray into trying to pass a public policy initiative, and it was successful. I mean, it was a huge initiative with many different organizations. But, you know, we went to read the books, understood the 501c3 rules, where it's not that you can't be political, it's not even that you can't lobby, that you actually can lobby, and we lobby all the time. It's just that there's a kind of rule for how much you can lobby. And so we're very attentive to those things. And one of our biggest projects is right now with Tanika Johnson, which is called Inequities for Sale, which is looking at the history of unjust land sale contracts, which there was a Duke University study that came out that showed that between 75 to 95% of homes sold to black families during a period of time were sold via land sale contracts, which were a way that it was an unscrupulous practice where would-be home buyers were locked out of a traditional mortgage by really racist processes. And it was estimated that it was a systemic, legally sanctioned plunder of black wealth to the tune of over $3.2 billion. And so Tanika decided that she wanted to bring attention to these issues and make actual memorial and monuments in front of the houses that had been sold under the land sale contracts, and then to use this as a tool to organize residents in Englewood to push for a reparations package. And so that reparations package is now making its way through City Hall. And it's a really beautiful project that if you're interested, you can go to our website. There's a podcast associated with it, and also a kind of a lot of town halls as well. All right, cool. So now I'm going to switch a little gears for a different kind of project too. So the biggest gallery of the museum is actually dedicated to everyday objects. And maybe around 5 years ago, I had a conversation with Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative. And he and I talked about how we have made huge, huge gains in holding up the stories of exceptionalism on the one hand, and also recognizing the importance of telling the stories of indignities and tragedy. But the realm of the vernacular and everyday is still so much in the grasp of white supremacy. And so in response, I sort of thought, yeah, like for a while, the museum was telling these stories of exceptional people who'd come from public housing, and then for a while we switched and started telling like very tragic stories. And we were like, well, what would happen if we actually just focused on the vernacular and the everyday? And so I curated an exhibit called History Lessons, Everyday Objects from the History of Chicago Public Housing. And we asked residents which objects that they thought would best tell their stories, and then asked them to join us in writing workshops to create the labels for these objects, rather than sort of traditional tombstone labels as they are referred to in museum parlance. And this would consciously challenge the sort of, and go outside the conventional rectangular box of factual evidence, and wouldn't present the object in any way as a kind of objective, omniscient way to understand public housing, but a really intimate, personal, unapologetically subjective label that ended up being sort of sometimes prose, sometimes poetry, sometimes an artwork, but they were always infused with desire and love and guts and humor, and so fascinating and interesting to read. And the objects were so extraordinary because they were so ordinary. A kind of Letterman jacket of one of the first residents of Jane Addams' homes, who also was Chicago's third grade marble champion. this really beautiful Pyrex bowl, which was passed down through 2 different generations. And residents came together, and they had, as part of a writing prompt, we had read Natasha Trethewey's history lesson, and so they were like, oh, this is what this exhibition should be called for sure. And we had storytelling circles with one another, and the objects we collected were just so beautiful in sort of total, because it really did tell the entire story of Chicago public housing. And the things that we were so surprised at some level, people were like, well, surely you're going to curate it, right? Like, and what they meant was I would sort of enforce an aesthetic sensibility and pick what was in and what was out. And we really didn't. It was we used sort of, I think, very good cultural organizing and engagement skills to reach a broad audience of people from the entire history. But then we just really asked them, what would you want to be in this museum? And I was really proud when this tiny little exhibit in our temporary space was named one of the best museum exhibits of 2018. And just last week, it's a little bit embargoed, but we got a really beautiful, sort of grant as part of this NEH process to do a national collecting and national writing project. And so Audrey Petty is going to be our writer, who is going to be working with public housing residents in Los Angeles and Houston and NYCHA, and also a rural community outside in Pennsylvania, to do a sort of rotating series of objects that will be in this large exhibition hall. And sort of the death knell of a historic house museum, I think, is you put one exhibit in and it just stays there forever. Many people will say, oh, I've gone to the Emily Dickinson house, that was great, I went when I was 16. But you would never really say that about an art institute or a contemporary art museum. And so for me, the really important thing about National Public Housing Museum is that it should have constantly rotating exhibits. And so this whole methodology is that we're committed to doing writing workshops across the country with residents, and just sort of, and it will not be a collecting museum for these objects. We'll just take them for the one-year loan and then return them, which was very stressful to the board, because they were very traditional in their sensibility that, oh, if we're going to be a great museum, we're going to have to collect amazing objects, and this really pushed against that idea. But the kind of history that was hidden in plain sight created this opportunity to understand a neglected part of cultural and political history that makes up vibrant public housing residents and communities. One of my favorite historians is Robin D.G. Kelley, and he has described this as forms of everyday resistance, or as dissident political culture that manifests itself in daily conversations, folklore, jokes, songs, cultural practices, and everyday objects. And while historians who study the politics of public housing usually emphasize the histories of organized protests, tenant rent strikes, landmark lawsuits, consent decrees, policy initiatives, Robin D.G. Kelley suggests that there are many insights to be gained when we expand the realm of the political to include daily acts and everyday objects, including disorganized, unintentional thoughts and actions, and incipient feelings that have a cumulative effect on power relations, whether they were intended to or not. And so there's this kind of space of the museum for that theory of history telling to sort of take place. But in the museum, there's also sort of what many people consider the heartbeat of the museum. It was always imagined that there would be 3 uniquely restored apartments that interpret the nation's public housing experience from the New Deal to the present day, that connected the intimate lives of diverse families who lived in the Jane Addams homes to the national policies and cultures that they helped to shape. And so, based on our oral histories, we did curate and choose one family, the Turovitz Medor family. They're a Jewish family that moved into the homes right when it opened, and in their oral history, and as Turovitz Medor said, for my mother, public housing meant having her first kosher kitchen one untouched by pork, because they were a Jewish family, and she was so excited. And so, we sort of worked with them to collect their artifacts. And in this apartment, which tells the story of the early sort of 1937 Housing Act and the first families who moved in, there's also a beautifully restored kosher kitchen that tells the story of migration. And it challenges people's notions of who lived in public housing. And so when you go to the museum, the whole museum is free except for the 3 apartments, which are a time ticket. And so then you would go through the sort of apartments, and you would first have the tour of the Jewish family that lived in public housing. And then you're sort of brought to the next apartment, which is 3 different stories of 3 different families, the Rizzi family, the Podlasky family, and we're still trying to figure out exactly if we're going to work with a Puerto Rican family story or a Mexican family that moved and then sort of went back. So we're still actually grappling a little bit with whose story, what we're going to tell in that space. But what we did know was that we wanted to integrate art, because we were looking at all the images, and so we were like, oh, are we just going to recreate that another apartment? Is that going to be fun, or is that going to be terribly boring? And then we sort of knew that in that period of that history of that apartment, we would have to tell the story of redlining, the federally sanctioned process through the FHA of taking all these maps and redlining them and showing where people could and should be getting mortgages and other places not. That has really indelibly shaped all of our cities across the nation and reinforced and enforced not only segregation, but also economic inequality. And we had this exhibit called Undesign the Red Line. Maybe many people, it traveled all across the country, and it was filled with really important facts and policy, and it was actually a very popular exhibit, and a lot of people loved it. It was an engagement exhibit, which meant that everybody put up a lot of sticky notes. That's I always think 3M should be the biggest funder of museums, because that's the only thing that exhibitions do, put a sticky note here, But it was really empty. We just did not feel like this told the story of redlining in any way that would make people learn things. But as you all know, in the sort of primal sort of core of museum exhibition making, it's you not only teach people new things of what they can think, but new things of how people can feel, but then you also want to sort of present new ways of doing things, right? It's thinking, feeling, and doing, and this exhibit was really all in the head of sort of thinking. And so what we decided to do was instead turn to art. We had come to know this really wonderful group called Manual Cinema, and they do beautiful puppetry work, and they had been chosen to do all of the images in the new Candyman movie. And they were really excited to work with us to tell the history of redlining. But they really didn't know so much about it, and so they said, we need to actually find somebody who will write the script for us. And so we sort of, talked to a bunch of people, and I'm really excited that Nicole Hannah-Jones is writing the script for this particular apartment series, and she has written a lot about the history of redlining, and especially how it links not just through housing, but also through public education, and she expands the story to public health. And I'll just sort of, for those of you who have not seen Manual Cinema's sort of work, I just want to share. So they do sort of light and puppetry with no sound. And so when people come into the second apartment, it looks like an apartment, but then the educator will ask people to take a seat in the apartment, and then the lights will dim, and then this really beautiful, immersive 6-minute sort of experience will come that will tell and unfold the story of redlining. It's so creepy, it's amazing. Anyway, and then in the third apartment, which I'm super excited about because it's a fully recreated apartment, and it's based on the family of Reverend Marshall Hatch and his sisters who lived there, and they have the most beautiful story of how their mother, who was so committed to education, would not let them watch TV. They could only read the encyclopedia and the great books, and when you listen to their oral history, they are like quoting Aeschylus and talking about it, like all the sort of great books, because that's what they grew up with. And for them, they said, but when Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King came to Chicago for the open housing movement, their mother said, we have to get a television. But they can only watch TV if MLK was on. And so in the oral history, Rona says, oh, we thought that box was that TV was MLK TV. It was so beautiful. So in the sort of apartment that is fully restored, there will of course be the family's Panasonic TV, but it will be playing the history of MLK and Coretta Scott King sort of images, and like you'll be able to then get this really large national history, but through the intimate kind of micro history of this family. And this is a history that, in Chicago at least, is really undertold. People have started to explore it because we like to think that these kinds of protests against racial equity only happen in the South. But Martin Luther King faced incredible resistance to his push to have open housing and integration, and so much so that in one of these marches he was injured because somebody threw a rock, and he said, I've never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hateful as in Chicago. So it will be a kind of reckoning story in that apartment as well. But the apartment has also something that's a little bit special, which is when we're looking at all the images that the family showed us, and also the images that we've been collecting of public housing throughout the nation, we just noticed that there was this green paint that was always present. And in oral histories, people would also say, oh, when we got the apartment, it was this terrible, icky green, but then we would repaint it. And so we were like, what's up with this green paint? And so we started to do some research around it, and we also collected our sort of own green paint in the museum, and we preserved one of the green walls in the building. And then we realized the story was really interesting because there was an activist from Altgeld, Miss Hazel Johnson, who was an environmental justice activist. She's called the mother of environmental justice. Her husband had died of lead paint poisoning, and she was organizing, against the lead paint, which this green paint was. And so there was this huge push to get rid of the green paint. And so we tried to locate extra cans of this green paint, and it was this incredible hush-hush with HUD, and nobody would talk to us about it. But we have put together a really beautiful environmental justice exhibit about lead paint poisoning. And so how it will envelop in the kitchen is that the kitchen is actually going to have the Marshall Hatch's, on the top left is Marshall Hatch's birthday party, and you'll just sort of enter into this kitchen, but then the sort of wall will push back and the table will open. An educator will invite you to sort of sit around the table, and there's going to be a conversation about environmental justice issues around lead. And we just had a lead paint workshop with a lot of different activists, and there's so many fascinating things that are happening in lead paint activism right now, and so I'm excited to add that as sort of the final part of the tour that you would have in the Hatch family apartment. The museum has all sorts of other things I'm not going to get to talk to you about today, including a sort of advocacy and engagement room, which has an incomplete history of public housing protests. It also has a really beautiful music room, which is dedicated to listening to the songs from public housing residents. But the biggest thing is that we recently made a partnership with CHA and Related Midwest in a difficult moment, but to actually have mixed income housing in the back of the building. And it was a really big debate amongst staff, amongst our board, but we realized that, one, we wanted to actually be a museum that had housing in it, and so we pushed really hard to have a lot of public housing units and affordable housing units. And then ultimately, when we were talking to residents, they said, well, this is your chance to sort of test your theory of change, that culture and organizing can actually pull people together, and that you would be then in a building right next to 15 units of housing, and this could be so incredible. And so that's sort of one of the newest things that has happened in the museum. Now, the last thing I just want to end with is a really quick story about an experience I had when I was co-teaching a museum studies class in Stateville Prison. Now, the thing about prisons is that while funding for public housing has been slashed across during the period of the Plan for Transformation by at least $17 billion, a reduction of 61%. Funding for prisons and corrections was boosted by $19 billion, an increase of 171%, which effectively makes the construction of prisons the nation's main housing program for the urban poor. So when we were teaching this class in Stateville, it was about museums and public housing, and this happened right before the pandemic, and the class was sadly, cut short right in March when everything shut down. But after a class where the guys, read and vigorously discussed Elaine Hoyman-Gurian's work, and they were grappling with the writings of Ivan Karp and Amelia Jones and others, we discussed how too many museums are not fully realizing their potential and obligations to community. And one student, Ronaldo, asked why I felt so attached to the word museum. Like, why didn't I just call this place something different, like the National Public Housing Community Center or Organizing Hub? Like, why did I need to be a museum? And then Fred B. asked something that really floored me and everyone in the class, where he said, wait, what if museums that you're trying to change and sort of have them realize their potential, they're actually doing exactly what they're supposed to do? Museums are supposed to further capitalism, misogyny, imperialism, and the carceral state. And there it kind of was, right? Like this moment of why am I and why are so many people so invested in transforming the museum, realizing the museum of the future, sort of bringing the museum back to the core. And so when we were talking, they sort of went back to the readings, as we often like to do, and they were like, wait a minute, in this Elaine Hoyman-Gurian essay, she talks about how one of the first museums in the Western civilization was the Louvre, right? And it was actually created from a revolution. It was stormed, 4 times, in 1830, in 1832, 1848, and 1871. And the vision behind it was we want to take the king's stuff and say it actually belongs to us. And they started to sort of say, yeah, maybe there is a kind of revolutionary history of the museum. And maybe it is true that a museum needs to be brought back to the right side of history rather than the wrong, and it's going to require us to sort of take on this task sort of one object at a time. And why should we relinquish this word to people who have completely devastated and emptied out the revolutionary potential of the museum? Now, one might also ask, who is the us and who is the we in the project of reimagining the museum? Who is the we charged with this cultural labor and undertaking? And I love this section of The Color of Law, the really important Richard Rothstein book, where he beautifully writes at one point, I will frequently refer to things we have done or things we should do. We means all of us, the entire community. Rothstein goes on to acknowledge that few of us may be the direct descendants of those who have perpetrated wrongs or even those who are its most exploited victims. But we, all of us, owe this to ourselves. And as citizens, whatever roots we are or a particular ancestor took to get to this point, we're all in this together now. And this is true when talking about the history of art, public housing, schools, or museums. There's always the possibility that our efforts to remake, rehabilitate, reimagine, and transform the museum may not be successful. Maybe the institution is too far gone, too implicated, too inscribed in the history of wrongdoing. And I certainly hope not. And I always end whatever talk I do with my most favorite quote from the great poet, philosopher, and writer, Tony Cade Bambara, who says, the role of the cultural worker is to make revolution irresistible. And I think that is the work that we are doing at the National Public Housing Museum, and I am so excited to share it with you today. Thank you. Yeah. So I just want to let you know that there is this cube. Is there? It's the question cube.
Right, there's a question.
And so if you have a question, then you get to have the cube thrown to you, which is the extra incentive to ask a question because there's a mic in it. Goodness, nobody wants to throw the cube.
Yes.
Oh, there is a cube.
Melissa,
All right.
yeah.
Yay!
Hi, I'm Melissa. Two questions. One, not, or maybe, I don't know. One is, how is the Chicago Historical Society responding, helping, not helping, whatever? And the other is, in the headshot of you at the very beginning, it's a very nice picture, and then I notice there's somebody holding a hairbrush. Like, what's that about?
I know, that's good. Maybe I'll start with the second question because I think it actually informs maybe the first. So I, as Kirsten said, my background is German studies. And so like the lens by which I do my museum work is of course through like of museum writers and thinkers, but also through sort of Brecht and all sorts of other people that I actually studied. And that's like kind of the particular way that I come at it. And whenever I'm talking to students, I always say, like, you will have your own toolbox from whatever disciplinary field you have, and it's really important to deploy all of those things. And so when I was getting a kind of headshot done, at one point, the woman who was doing my hair got the brush caught in the view. And the photographer said, oh my gosh, that's obviously a throwaway, blah, blah, blah. This one is so much better. And then I started thinking about Brecht's critique of Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk. And like this idea that the labor is always so hidden, right? And also, as we know now, I think one of the most exciting movements in the museum field is museum workers speak. The people who are sort of making visible the frontline workers and who's actually doing the work, right? It's no longer the kind of, director, sort of trustees, curators. Like there's so many other people in the museum that are making this sort of organism function. And so I actually use that as my headshot often because I want people to see the labor of what is happening. Yeah, it's my Brechtian thing. But the thing about the Chicago History Museum, which used to be Chicago Historical Society, and there was a really engaged process to become more inclusive. So they changed their name from society to museum, which is, that was a really big thing, is that I think they're a wonderful institution that at different times has actually done really important work, and also exhibits. Like they had one of the most epic and important teen programs that incorporated young people, right, and made history visible and meaningful and important. We use their archives all the time because they're as a collecting museum, they have a really beautiful archive. They have a really different monetary structure. They're part of something called Museums in the Park, and so a big percentage of their operating budget is sort of gifted to them, basically, in a way that they deserve, like many other institutions who are on the park, And it's like a kind of strange elitism when that happens. Like, I think the whole philanthropic world is really broken. But the thing is, when you actually have to go and raise money sometimes, you really are thinking about, like, who are the people that you're serving? And then if you don't have to raise it so much because it's coming in various ways through a really amazing board and all these kinds of things, like it liberates you in one way, but it also, I think, emancipates you from like the people that you really should be serving, And so there's a way where I'm not going to trash talk them like in public. I sort of am a little bit, but I mean, I think that they're doing their work, and I think, they had an amazing sort of exhibit about Jane Addams where they sort of represented her to the world as gay, which was very like landmark and all of these things. I wouldn't say that they're experimenting with museology. They're not engaged in land back conversations. Like there's a really, as you all know maybe, that, in national parks and other places, people are thinking about amazing ways of making reparations to the atrocities of what we have done to indigenous communities. And they're just like not there, So, I think they're a wonderful institution, but I personally, we don't work with them that much. We collaborate on public programs, but for like museology, for programs and things like that, they're not as experimental, I think, as they could be in leveraging who they are. Yeah. Look, cube. Oh my gosh, it's so scary. Kirsten, are you really going to throw? Oh my gosh. Yes, that's good.
I feel really vindicated from my bad high school gym years. Hi, I'm Estrella. Thank you so much for this. Now, I was curious, where is this situated? Like around the area, is there like a bus stop that's close by? Is there public housing that is currently running that's in the area? Is it close to other museums? Is it something that I would, obviously it's not by the Mag Mile or anything like that, but is it something that I could bump into, or is it something that people really deliberately have to go to when thinking about a museum?
Yeah. So one of the things that Kirsten said, which was wrong in her introduction, because it was so lovely and praisey that I didn't want to say anything was wrong. But so, we're actually not open in that space yet. So that's like one thing. I don't know. I sort of used the tenses maybe in a way that, and I feel so embarrassed because I think when I first started there, I was like, I'm going to have this institution open in a year. And I committed it to it in scholarly articles in journals where like, we will be open in 2019. And then it was like, we will be open in 2020. So we really are planning on breaking ground in May. And partly it was because of this landmark partnership that we had made with CHA to create housing, which enabled us to have like this massive $5 million boost in our capital campaign. And it's on the near west side of Chicago. And so Hull House is just a scant half-mile away. The UIC campus is here. It's in the traditional, what some people call Little Italy, and the sort of big hospital district is to the left of it. There are still the remnants of public housing communities called ABLA, which was this sort of moniker for the Jane Addams homes, the Brooks home, the Loomis, all these sort of this big public housing complexes. And when they knock them down, and if you think about the way the language is used and the other political movements that use these kinds of languages and the kinds of solidarities that we could and should be forging, in the Plan for Transformation, if you got your building knocked down, you could either take a voucher or you could hold on to your right to return. And so this idea was, instead of getting a voucher to like move to Lincoln Park or use somewhere else, you would hold on to this voucher and say, I want to return to my old neighborhood when you rebuild the housing. Now, some people now have been holding on to the right to return to for 15 years, right? And so in many of the conversations, and the math just doesn't work out with mixed income housing. If you take down 80 units, or I'll do easy math, if you take down 90 units of housing and you replace it with 1/3 public, 1/3 affordable, and 1/3 market, you're only going to get 30 units of public housing. What happens to the other 60 people, right? And it's like that duh thing that the question never really gets asked, and when it does, it never gets answered. And so there's still tons of vacant lots. The housing crisis sort of happened, the market fell apart, COVID happened, and so the excuse was they sort of hadn't built. So right next to us is a giant vacant lot. There is still public housing nearby, and part of our community benefits agreement is a commitment to study the gentrification that we undoubtedly will contribute to in that neighborhood as well, and not just to study it, but then also to make a commitment to really push for additional affordable housing, additional public housing, and things like that. And there's a neighborhood community, which will hold us accountable. And also, we have around a fifth of our board is also public housing residents and members from the community. Yeah, and you can get there by a bus. There isn't a L stop nearby, but it's like walkable. So there's bus routes and everywhere. And so you could happen upon it if you were going to get a really good cannoli in a neighborhood or a really good Italian beef, but you would go there, yeah.
Okay, one last question, and then. Okay, Mona, now you have to take this one here.
Awesome.
Hi, thank you so much. This was so wonderful to be able to catch. This question just came to me as you were talking about this right to return. And I was thinking a lot about the Palestinian community and this idea of right of return that people are denied. And I'm wondering specifically in the Chicagoland area, the plethora of immigrant communities who might not have experienced public housing themselves due to a variety of reasons, but might be really interested in supporting your work because of language barriers, socioeconomic barriers, and just cultural barriers. They might not be aware that they care about it. They don't know that these are their political values or that this is a conversation that they want to be part of or they want to learn more about. So I was just wondering from, what's your vision in terms of pulling in populations that might really be excited about your work, but just not know that they are? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, of course, and I'm happy that you heard the resonance. And for us, our mission is actually to make sure that everybody has a right to a place to call home, right? And so what's happening in Palestine is really important to that mission. If you were to take the mission seriously and not to just be so narrow. And something that I learned from my work at Hull House and from my true commitment to the Sites of Conscience methodology is that if you think about any issue that matters to people, anyone, it is so interconnected with all the issues of another person who's sitting next to you, which is interconnected with the issues of someone else, right? And at Hull House, it was that way. As white women who were privileged and wanted to go into the workplace, they were like, oh, shit, we have to think about childcare, right? And so they started this kindergarten. But then when kids would sort of disappear because they were going into the factories, they were like, oh, we should be passing, anti-child labor laws. And then when children were being thrown into jails and, sort of workhouses because they were considered truant, they were like, oh, we should have juvenile justice. And all of these things were linked together from being white women who wanted to go into the workplace, right? And it's the same thing with this housing museum. I often feel like it doesn't matter which museum I'm at, I'm actually working on all the same issues, right? And the issues that matter today are the things that you want to make the museum relevant to, right? So if it's not relevant to what's happening in Palestine, then somehow I feel like we're not actually doing our jobs. And we have had exhibits and we've had public programs around, sort of the apartheid state and what's happening there. The thing that is really important is when we recruit staff and when we're talking to people, I think the most important skill, in addition to having read your Adorno, which everyone should, is that also, and I'm sort of joking but not, is that I think being a good community organizer, right? Caring about movement building. And it's not so much about outreach, as we know, which is a very outdated notion, but really finding ways of expressing solidarity with people, having a kind of radical generosity and inviting people in, and also knowing that the people with the so-called problems are the people with the solutions. All the things that Ella Baker, all the things that Grace Lee Boggs, all the things that great organizers have taught us of how to work in community. And that is really the best museum sort of tool that we need. And so, yes, we don't get the sort of message out to everybody, but we see that as a critically important part of our work. And because we don't define, there's a stupid debate that we're having with board and staff, which is public housing Section 8 housing or not? Do voucher people sort of count or not? Because there's a kind of core group of public housing residents from the original projects who are like, oh, you know what? People who sold out and got a voucher, they're not actually the people that we should be, like our primary stakeholders. Now, I think that's an important debate and conversation to have, but I'll just sort of end with the one story that I always tell, and this is like very, very critical. It's like the secret to museum work, okay? Which is in the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa, they defined truth in 4 different ways. They said that there was forensic truth, very important. What day was it that something happened? What actually happened, like somebody's arm was blown off or whatever it may be, right? That's forensic truth. But there was also our individual narrative truth, because the person who like planted the bomb might have a different narrative truth than the person who actually was affected by it, right? And that these narrative truths were often in contest with one another. So then there was a third truth, which was called dialogic truth, which is the truth that we need to create from these different sort of narrative truths coming into contact with one another. But then the most important truth, which is the work of civic organizations and civil society, basically, is to create restorative truth. All these other things need to be out there, and they are, but an institution doesn't need to be necessarily committed to those one things. The institution needs to recognize all those truths and then to think about how to create justice, right? And so for me, the kind of work out there is, if we are doing that work well through civic love, through public programs, through the ways that we tell stories, through the multi-languages in which that we, sort of present our labels and all those things, then it sort of pushes us towards a world where the museum truly can be, the thing that creates sort of what Cornel West has said, right? It's like what love looks like in public, which is justice.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Our students will meet Lisa tomorrow night in the classroom.
So excited.
There will also be a workshop on Thursday at 10 a.m. And if you want to still participate, write me an email at barndt, B-A-R-N-D-T, @umich.edu, or to Amy Smolder, Museum Studies Program. And I'll see some of you at the reception at my house, right in, 10 minutes. Okay, so have a good evening, and thank you for coming.
Cool, thank you so much.